Hello, magandang hapon po ulit sa ating lahat. Today is Thursday and we're here again to discuss human rights concerns sa Pilipinas. No? And this afternoon po ay napaka-importante ng ating pag-uusapan. Dahil kahapon ay lumabas na po o na-adapt na ng Human Rights Council ng United Nations ang isang technical cooperation para ma-improve ang kalagayan ng human rights sa Pilipinas, no? At ito po ay galing doon ito po ay resulta ng report ng Office of High Commissioner na meron daw systematic, no, at gross violation na nangyari sa Pilipinas, lalo na doon sa usapin ng war on drugs. Ngayong hapon ay pag-uusapan natin, ano ba ang laman nitong resolution na ito? At ano bang ibig sabihin ng technical cooperation? Talaga bang makakatulong ito para ma-improve ang kalagayan ng karapatang pantao sa Pilipinas? Ngayong hapon po ay lahat ng ating mga panelists, ng ating mga guests ay magbabanggit, no, ng mga importanteng kalagayan, no? At sasagutin po ito ng isa nating special guest from the Office of the High Commissioner, ang Human Rights Advisor nila na kasama natin. Kaya ipagpasensya din po kasi medyo mas maraming English ang ating pag-uusap ngayon. Pero titiyakin namin na eventually ay maita-translate natin ito sa Tagalog para lahat tayo ay makaintindi. Ngayong hapon, we are also glad that Amnesty International Human Rights Advocacy Officer, si Mr. Wilnor Papa, ang siya pong tutulong para mag-moderate sa atin. Wilnor?
Hi Rose, magandang hapon sa lahat ng ating mga taga-panood at mga nakikinig, no? Kasi hindi naman lahat ay tutok na tutok yung kanilang mata sa video pero nakikinig pa rin. Salamat Rose. Again, yun nga, nabanggit nga ni Rose, no? Napasa po yung resolution kahapon at meron tayong tinatawag na, of course, nakita nyo naman, no? Parang feeling of dismay sa pagtingin natin na parang may collective failure, no? Sana it was an opportunity that we were looking at, but let's see po paano po tatakbo tong 2 oras na ito, no? A bit of a background po, bagamat nasabi na ni Rose yung iba kanina. The report of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the 44th session of the United Nations Human Rights Council shed light on the worsening state of human rights in the Philippines. Yung report na yan po ay available yan online. And despite the government's promise to fully cooperate with local and international mechanisms, human rights groups note with grave concern that extrajudicial killings associated with the government's war on illegal drugs persist without substantial investigation and prosecution of perpetrators. The crackdown and vilification against human rights defenders have intensified, and repressive draft legislation and executive policies aimed to silence dissent has been fast-tracked. Ayan, kasama na po dyan yung tinatawag nating Antiterror Act. And despite intensive campaigns by civil society organizations at the UN Human Rights Council towards an independent international investigation into the human rights crisis in the country, the 45th session issued a resolution focused largely on technical cooperation and capacity building. This resolution was a disappointment to local and international CSOs who called the exercise a collective failure of the state members of the council and called for renewed inquiry of the killings and called for the renewed inquiry of the killings did not cease. On the part of the Philippine-based human rights NGOs, the issue of accountability appears to have been set aside in favor of an agreement that falsely supposes there is a working justice system for gross human rights violations in the country. CSOs believe that the policy environment does not exist for such an agreement to be effective. Nevertheless, human rights defenders will engage the process to encourage the transparent and effective implementation of the agreement. Ito pong live stream na ito, ang gusto po sana nating lumabas ay yung lumabas at mapag-usapan, no? Ano po ba yung mga specifics nitong tinatawag nating technical cooperation? And more specifically, mapag-usapan din, no, with the UN Resident Coordinator kung paano nangyari itong mga negotiation na to, no? Paano rin ang implementation na ito, mapag-usapan kung anong role ng civil society organizations, ng mga human rights NGOs. And then, ano po ba yung policy direction na pwede nating i-push no, sa government na ito para sa framework ng ating technical cooperation. Kasama po natin ngayon no, ang mga batika no, at mga bigatin. Hindi po bigatin dahil sa lockdown at wala kaming ginagawa, wala lang exercise na nangyayari. Bigatin, mga heavyweight na matagal ko na pong mga kasama, matagal ko na pong mga nakakatrabaho no, sa larangan ng karapatang pantao, pagtaguyod ng karapatang pantao. We are joined by Ms.Signe Enriquez. Siya po yung Executive Director ng Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, Asia Pacific. Isa po sila sa mga women's organization na una kong nakatrabaho nung ako po ay pumasok sa Amnesty International. We have Attorney Paulo Santiago, no? Siya po ang Executive Director ng Ateneo Human Rights Center. Mas matanda po sa akin ng 2 taon, pero mukha siyang 10 years younger. Si Ms. Judy Pasimio po, no? Ang spokesperson ng iDEFEND at Executive Director po ng LILAK, no, anything that has something to do with the rights of women, human rights, women, Indigenous Peoples po, no, karapatan nila, paano po tinataguyod, siya po ang go-to person namin. Of course, one of our parang matagal na rin namin katrabaho sa Commission on Human Rights, sa Commissioner Karen, andyan din po siya. And of course, as Rose has mentioned, you know, we are happy to have Ms.Signe Poulsen, Senior Human Rights Advisor for the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. So sila po ang ating mga tagapagsalita at mga guests ngayon. But before we start, meron po tayong ipapalabas na video mula dun sa report ng ng Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights patungkol sa war on drugs in the Philippines.
Thousands have been killed since 2016, when the so-called war on drugs was launched. When the campaign against illegal drugs was launched, it was launched through a command circular that laid out how police operations should be conducted. Now, this circular contained a lot of language that almost encouraged violations of due process. Terms such as negation and neutralization of drug suspects were used. This ominous-sounding language was never really defined in this command circular, but this language, coupled with verbal encouragement at the highest level of government for police to kill drug suspects, may have been interpreted as permission to kill. We've examined 25 police reports which strongly suggest that guns were planted on drug suspects who had been killed. We also looked at 22 other reports which show the use of cut and paste language in post-operative investigations into such killings, which seem to show that these reports were not filled out with integrity. In the 25 reports that we examined, the serial numbers of guns that were found on the drug suspects were exactly the same, which suggests that these guns may have been planted on the drug suspects who have been killed in the aftermath of the killing to make it look like the killing took place in self-defense. Now, this is obviously very worrying.
Thank you, Neka. Hindi na po natin patatagalin pa, no? Let's jump to the first topic, first issue. Human rights violations in the context of the campaign against illegal drugs. At ito po ay pangungunahan po ni Ms.Signe Enriquez, the Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, Asia Pacific. Jean?
Maraming salamat, Wilnor. Maraming salamat para iDEFEND rin sa pag-host nitong programang ito. First, I would like to respond to the government press release on this development. One, this is not a complete U-turn at all, since there remains to be condemnation of state intimidation against groups working to protect human rights. Second, since India, Hungary, Turkey, Thailand, and other states parties to the resolution are also accountable for numerous human rights violations, the lamentable resolution does not come as a surprise. Third, the women survivors are certainly not happy with the resolution because accountability seeking is long due. But this will not stop us. It will not stop women survivors of violence from pushing for accountability. Just this morning, we finished another complaint against PhilHealth officials for violating the Magna Carta of Women, which we will file with the Commission on Human Rights. Since 2017, the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women Asia Pacific in the Philippines has expanded our work on violence against women to include the emerging forms of violence. We assert that the widows, mothers, and other women and girls orphaned by the extrajudicial killings ordered by the President of the Philippines and followed by the Philippine National Police are victim survivors of violence against women, as defined in the 1993 UN Declaration on VOW. The torment, the profound psychological, emotional, and economic suffering of the women survivors of EJK, as well as the use of women's bodies by police officers in exchange for the women's life and liberty of their family members, constitute violence that resulted in physical, sexual, and psychological harm and suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion, or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or in private life, as so defined. The eventual pregnancy of some of the women resulting from the police officers' repeated rape of the women constitutes torture. All this and even the direct killing of some women relatives of tagged drug users violate the women's fundamental rights to life, security of person, dignity of person, right to the highest attainable standard of health, right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, or herself for that matter, to freedom from torture, among others. We assisted 136 women relatives of EJK in a sustained manner in the last 3 years, 15 of whom are victims of rape, of sex for freedom. We conducted psychological first aid, relief operations up to this day, especially during the pandemic, empowerment trainings and advocacy activities. This is a crisis, but the women did not receive any systematic nor sporadic assistance from the government in forms of relief, recovery, and reintegration. The killings and sex for freedom constituted multiple violations of women's human rights, right to life, right to security, and other rights I've mentioned in the beginning, including right to jobs with dignity and right to economic development. Most of the survivors have no sustainable income to begin with, except for 4 women in the communities I mentioned. All the other women had to earn income informally, doing laundry, domestic work, selling retail goods. Some were returning migrants and victims of trafficking abroad or locally. Therefore, because of the EJK, many more became vulnerable to trafficking and sexual abuse, as narrated by the women themselves to us. None of the EJK victims resisted or fought back or nanlaban, as the government claimed, because many of them were sleeping. Most of the operations happened at nighttime. None of the victims had weapons. 10 of the women we assisted were senior citizens. Outside of the project, we had to source wheelchairs for them to ease their mobility. And at their age, they still need to earn income for their children and grandchildren after the loss of the breadwinners in the families. For all of them, advocacy for sustainable jobs is most needed, other than protection from further abuse. The women know that they were being targeted because they are poor. And while drug use and peddling were not limited to urban poor communities, they were the only ones penalized, illegally at that, through killings and warrantless arrests. For the women, it was clear that the Philippine president is responsible for the mass killings. They expressed that they heard the president's order to kill anyone involved with drugs. They also said that it would not be at this scale if the president does not know it. As one widow also analyzed, sabi niya, ang pagdodroga ay masamang gawain. Ang pagpatay ba ay hindi? Using drugs is bad, but killing is not. The data from the women and the key informants we interviewed are strong basis to pursue legal cases. However, given that public officials reiterate remarks of the president And given the lack of judicial victories in filed cases, there is no trust in the local justice system. Killings continue to this day. In Quezon City, Bulacan, and Manila, we documented cases this month as we suffer hunger under the pandemic-related lockdown. Just last week, another mother was communicating to me that in Tondo, a 17-year-old remains in the funeral parlor for lack of money for burial. There has been continuing incitement to hatred and violence, with gender-based and sexist remarks against women leaders and women in general by the president himself. The point remains that whether the human rights violations continue or not, it is incumbent upon the UN mechanisms to provide accountability measures in the absence of local access to justice. There has been no improvement that we can cite. Instead, we experience continuing repression, and we foresee that the situation will deteriorate fast due to the Executive Order 70 and the Antiterrorism Act. In fact, our organization filed a petition before the Supreme Court last September 11, and it is the 33rd among 37 petitions to date against the Antiterrorism Act. There is already a climate of fear in communities where we conduct relief and empowerment activities because of 3 years of killings, not only of drug suspects and their families, but also of activists, and because of threats particularly targeted towards women. Therefore, we will continue to push for independent and transparent mission to investigate the human rights situation in the Philippines. We will continue to call for reparation for victims. Under the pandemic, we know that many women have suicidal ideation, and we need more than ever support not only from the UN but the entire international community. We call for the passage of the HRD protection bill and the continuing participation of CSOs in the process that will proceed days or weeks after this. And we will definitely continue to report on human rights violations that we encounter or are happening to the people where we organize in our communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jean. This is very, concerning because, as Jean has mentioned, the killings continue, and this is the experience of the communities that Jean has been telling us for the past 5 or 7 minutes. So this is something that I think everyone should really remember. Everyone should really strive to put out there at the international community. Of course, to continue, sorry, medyo mabigat talaga dahil because what Gina shared is the same things that our communities have been sharing with us for the past few months. The killings hasn't stopped; it is continuing, and there's no end in sight. That's why I'm a little bit carried away by that. But nevertheless, we have to continue. Next speaker that we have will be discussing the overarching national security and counterterrorism legislative framework and its impact on the civic space in the country. So please join me in welcoming Attorney Paulo Santiago, the Executive Director of the Ateneo Human Rights Center.
Salamat, Wilnor. Magandang hapon po sa lahat at maraming salamat sa para iDEFEND para sa oportunidad na makibahagi dito. I'll give 5 points with regard to the issue that was assigned to me. Okay? And siguro for the 5 points, my first point is the environment where we are in at the moment. Hindi ko na sasabihin uulitin yung killings na sinasabi ni Jean at ni Wilnor na tuloy-tuloy pa rin. But I want to emphasize on further the environment. Environment natin we have a lot of warrantless arrests that are happening. And this is despite the fact that at the time, even before the Antiterrorism Act of 2020 was even passed, there had been a lot of documented warrantless arrests, particularly with regard to freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, those that are being posted on social media, and even those who are allegedly violating the quarantine regulations. So it's more of a perception by many of the law enforcers on whom to arrest, and then they will regard it as a valid warrantless arrest. Whether it is a valid warrantless arrest or not, of course, will take a lot of time because it has to be questioned in court, and I will go to that point later. Second is on the issue, well, still on the environment, is the issue of red tagging. We hear a lot of our government officials red tagging many groups who have been working for the rights of the vulnerable and marginalized groups. And this has, in a way, demonized them in the eyes of the public, and has also been, has also put many people in danger because of this red tagging. And with regard to the environment, there is still a lot of fake or alternative news that is going around. There's a lot of propaganda, unfortunately, coming from the side of government. Okay, propaganda that propagates fake news, no basis at all. And unfortunately, even during the recent budget hearings in Congress, for example, even the intelligence chief of our government admitted that on his personal capacity, he has been forwarding these news, even though he knows that there is no legitimate source for this news. The second point with this environment is the access to justice issues. In the report of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, it pointed out, and I quote, impunity and formidable barriers with regard to access to justice. Okay, so when we talk about impunity and formidable barriers, I think many of our Filipino citizens would commiserate. Alam nila kung gaano kahirap ang litigation in the Philippines. So as I mentioned earlier, people might be subjected to arrests, warrantless arrests, with the Antiterrorism Act of 2020. Okay? What is alarming here is that there is a provision there which allows the arrest without judicial warrants. Okay? Ang problema, the definition of terrorism is not clear. It is questionable. And then there is a provision on inciting to terrorism. And then it allows the arrests without judicial warrants, even though people are just suspected. So ano yung suma total nito? Yung suma total ay yung law enforcer, siya mismo mag-i-interpret. Ito ba ay pinagsususpetsahan ko ba na merong ginagawang acts of terrorism? O ito ba ay yung ginagawa ba niya inciting to terrorism? Yung sinasabi ba niya can lead to terrorism? So it's an interpretation of that law enforcer. And that law enforcer is empowered to arrest even those he or she is merely suspecting. Okay? So para ma-question to, you have to go to court. Okay? And it takes a long time. So that is the problem with access to justice. Nagiging mas masalimuot, mas magastos para dun sa tao na i-question at i-challenge yung aresto sa kanya. In the meantime, that person will have to endure being jailed. Okay? According to the Antiterrorism Act of 2020, which is now effective, pwede siyang makulong ng 14 up to 24 days without judicial charges. Okay? Yung pangatlong punto is pag pumunta tayo dun sa UN resolution, yung Iceland resolution dati leading towards an investigation for the Philippines. Okay? The OHCHR was asked to make a report on the human rights situation in the Philippines. The OHCHR came out with a very disturbing report. Disturbing kasi pinakita niya yung systematic and gross violations that are happening. Parang anticlimactic yung most recent resolution ng UN ngayon, ng UN Human Rights Council, okay, na let's go towards merely technical cooperation. Okay, parang friends ulit. Okay, is there an admission or an acceptance by the Philippines actually that the report of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights is actually accurate for it to say, then let's work on this. Okay, so the fifth point is I think we have to realize that when we're talking about the UN, we're talking about political, legal, and actual impact on the people. Naiintindihan natin ang karapatan-tao kasi ito ang actual na impact sa atin. Nakikita natin yung usaping legal kasi meron tayong human rights standards. Unfortunately, when we talk about international relations, okay, the countries, the member states, talk about political dealings, yung mga tinatawag na quid pro quo. So it's medyo nakakalungkot na yung naging anticlimactic, yung imbis na mabibigyang hustisya sana yung mga hinaing on human rights violations ng mga kababayan natin, mapupunta sa mere technical cooperation. Moving forward, how do we now even measure the sincerity of the government? Sabi nila, technical cooperation. Okay? Merong mga steps na ginagawa yung mga meron naman tayong mabubuting mga kawani ng nasa gobyerno. Okay? Kaya lang, when we look at the political bodies within government, parang iba yung sinasabi nila, parang magkaiba yung gustong gawin ng mga gustong sumulong ng karapatang pantao laban dun sa mga sinasabi ng mga nasa higher levels of our political echelons. Okay? So ibig sabihin, paano masusustain nga yung sinasabi dun sa report na meron namang small positive steps? How can we measure that sincerity? Okay, so yun ang tanong ngayon. So I hope that again, the moving forward on this technical cooperation will not rely merely on the political aspect, but we will rely on the legal and actual impact on the people. So maaasahan na itong mga grupo na nandito would still be very vigilant and will hold accountable any violators of human rights violations. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, RP. Very valid points, no. Kadikit din ito mga sinabi ni RP. I think magpapatotoo dito no, yung i-share na susunod nating speaker. Yung incitement to hatred and violence and its effects dun sa totoong sitwasyon ngayon ng mga indigenous peoples, farmers, and those who are considered internally displaced people. Para po pangunahan ng discussion na yan, we have iDEFEND's spokesperson and the executive director of LILAK, Ms. Judy Pasimio. Judy?
Oo, magandang hapon sa ating lahat. Good afternoon, everyone. Dugtungan ko yung kwento ni RP, ni Attorney RP. So, may Iceland resolution, gumawa ng report ang UNHCR, and after receiving and studying the reports and stories submitted to them, the Human Rights Commission report stated systematic, widespread killings and persistent impunity. We were heard. The families of the victims were heard. But part of the process is that the Philippines would have to submit its own response, its own report. At ito yung kwento ng Philippine government. Through the Department of Justice, it submitted a report. And yes, there were deaths. But that, sabi nila, not as many as 20,000 as these organizations are saying. 5,000 lang, 5,810 lang. We have mechanisms in place. Our justice system works. We are investigating the cases. We have created an interagency body to oversee these investigations. And those who are saying, those organizations who are saying otherwise, they are terrorists. They are communists, such as iDEFEND. So malinaw yun, nasa report, iDEFEND. There are thousands of other organizations registered which support the Duterte government. Dagdag pa sa narrative nila ay that we are cooperative and open to dialogues. At sabi nga ni Ambassador Garcia, in advancing discourse on human rights. In the tradition, and I quote, in the tradition of engagement with international institutions and development, human rights, accountability, and the rule of law. Such is the narrative of the Philippines, yung government. With this resolution that has been adopted unanimously in recognition of the efforts of the Philippine government, the UNHRC is now entering into a technical cooperation and capacity building. So, nga lang ba tayo? What is our task now? We continue to counter that narrative. Let us remind them, these countries, that this is Duterte who openly maligned, insulted UN special rapporteurs. If we would remember some of these, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Independence of Judges and Lawyers, si Diego Garcia Sayan, what did he say? That son of a bitch, he can go to hell. This after Garcia Sayan said that judicial independence in the Philippines was under attack in the light of the ouster of Chief Justice Sereno. Even then, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, ano sabi niya? Gago, he's a fool. And other series of sexist and foul remarks against UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions and ICC prosecutor. So lahat yan, human rights and the advocates and defenders of these have been religiously attacked, threatened, and in fact, in its report of the UNHRC, called us terrorists. In fact, Duterte wanted to leave UN, diba? How long ago was that? So how can Ambassador Garcia, with a straight face, even say those things about openness, constructive cooperation? But more shocking is, how can the UN actually accept all of these and forget about all of these, what Duterte has been doing and saying against UN and its peoples? But that is our task. We say never forget. Pang martial law lang. We bring that slogan to the UN. The UNGA address of Duterte was a stagecraft, and unfortunately, seemingly an ineffective stagecraft, precisely because it is feeling the heat from the international community. Again, what is astounding is that the UN bought this show, thus this lame resolution. What does this resolution do? It bureaucratizes human rights, and we cannot allow that. Human rights is not about capacity building projects. It's not about creation of yet another interagency body, oversight committees. We need to pursue the core of the HRC report. And what is this? Justice for the victims, accountability from the state, indemnification for the victims' families, protection for the human rights defenders. How will this be addressed by the technical cooperation and capacity building? In fact, we have heard how violations are still happening. And let me share a few sa hanay ng mga katutubo. And I will cite data from the International Working Group on Indigenous Affairs. Just within 2019, 9 indigenous peoples were killed, 8 frustrated murders, and a number of indigenous leaders have trumped up charges. Hundreds of victims of displacement, especially in Mindanao right now, because of militarization. During the pandemic, the military, which has been used by the Duterte as its main force in the lockdown measures, have also been used to intimidate leaders, especially leaders of the projects that are being championed by this government. Kaliwa Dam, Chico River Dam, and now we're talking about also the pushing of more mining projects in the country. Indigenous woman leader was killed purportedly as she was against illegal logging, brutally killed. Not just, I mean, to be killed is one thing, but to be brutally killed and say, we have nothing to do with that. It's a killing by another member of the tribe, and that's how killings of indigenous peoples are being treated. They are caught in the crossfire because they were cuddling communists, or they are victims, or they are part of the military operations. They were killed by military operations because they are rebels, or they are killed by other tribal indigenous communities. Not mentioning that these are paramilitary groups which are supported by the military. Recently, the executive director of the task force to end local communist armed conflict, si Kapuyan, has been going around the country within indigenous communities, because he is also the chair of the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples. But when he is going around, leaders would tell us that most of the talks are about counterinsurgency program. PowerPoint's presentation will be shown, naming leaders who are against mining, who are against logging, who are against plantations, naming them as communists or members of terrorist organizations, peddling this narrative that would justify the killings and arrests and harassment of the leaders. No, very little time has been spent on actually asking the indigenous peoples, how are you during this pandemic? Because the NCIP has not given any substantive amount as support to the indigenous communities. And yet this money, this budget of almost 19 million is being asked for the task force LCAC is going to be used for its anti-insurgency campaign. I just like to ask ourselves, why is there so much conflict within the indigenous communities? Because land as a resource is the subject of conflict. The main issue and the core of the issue is the land conflict. Oh, I'm being told it's 19 billion. I'm sorry. Yes, it's 19 billion being asked for the 2021 budget. And until the issue of land conflict will be addressed, then the violence will will continue, and then there will be opposition to this encroachment within the ancestral domain, and then they will be tagged as rebels or terrorists, especially with the passage of the Antiterrorist Law. So unless this is addressed, then the violence will continue. That is why also the indigenous peoples and LILAK have been part of the petition against the anti-terrorist law, because we know that this has been used and this will be used against those who will continue to protect their lands and continue to say no to the development agenda of this government. So the question that is being posed now is that how is this resolution offer even a tiny step towards breaking this chain of violence? It would seem nothing. But I would like, as hopeful as I am, I would like to have a hopeful takeaway from the speaker from Germany, who was also speaking for the EU. He said the success of the resolution will have to be measured on the impacts on the ground. So this shouldn't just be about projects. This shouldn't just be about interagency cooperations. This should have concrete results on issues of accountability, issues of impunity, and issues of justice for the victims of this continuing systematic violation that is happening under the Duterte administration. I'll end it there, and then later on we can discuss what are the concrete steps we can, if we want to be involved in this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Parang if there are any. Mabigat na mabigat yung iniwan ni Judy na parang challenge sa ating lahat din, so we know the situation on the ground, the enabling factors, why we are in this quagmire. Siguro medyo punta naman tayo doon sa resolution po mismo, paano po ba ito na-formulate, and what are the highlights of the technical cooperation and resolution na to for us to be able to understand it more, before we go to the nitty-gritties again of discussing if we can actually use this technical cooperation resolution or not. So to discuss this, we have Commissioner Karen Gomez Dumpit. So Karen, please take it away.
Thank you, Wilnor. Magandang hapon sa ating lahat. And thank you again to Para, iDEFEND, for including the Commission in this discussion. I'll be very brief. Let's concentrate on the resolution itself and what it contains so that everybody will be on the same page. But let me just siguro structure my talk on 3 points. First is process. Second, of course, is the context. and then we will go to the outcomes. No, first is the process. No, we were stunned by the presentation. We got a copy of the zero draft of the resolution, and of course we were quite stunned at the language that was included in that resolution. No? And just to say that on the Commission's part, nagsabi na po yung ating mga partners sa civil society. What we first, of course, we were quite surprised because there were references to the Commission on Human Rights in the zero draft that we were not even consulted on those things. No, first, we've seen, and some of these references to the CHR actually found its way in the press releases that we see today after the adoption of the resolution, no, on technical cooperation. So the first is, of course, our observation. We were not consulted, neither were civil society consulted during the zero draft. No? And then there were references to the CHR having significant budget increase. But of course, just to let you know that the only significant budget increase that we have had was actually through the intervention of the Senate when the allies of the president and even the president himself, following that pronouncement that he wanted the CHR abolished, wanted to defund us. No? So that was the only budget increase because of the insertions that were done by the Senate. All other increases are actually very standard, and it's not really that significant. Another thing was the reference to the data sharing agreement. No, one of the things that we said, and this found its way in the final version of the resolution, the data sharing agreement, as we all know, has just been recently signed, but there has been a perhaps a misrepresentation that this data sharing agreement actually covers all the deaths and all the killings that have been reported. This actually just pertains to AO35, which of course has a very narrow, or the scope is quite restrictive, and it just looks into the political killings, enforced disappearance, and torture cases. No? So it does not cover all of the instances and all of the human rights violations that were pointed out in the report of the High Commissioner. So this tends to be conflated with the interagency mechanism that Secretary Guevara actually promised in his response to the report of the High Commissioner. No? And then, of course, there were other things that found its way in the final draft. So if I can request NECA to actually present the draft so that we can see. No? In terms of context, the first thing that we said, at sinabi na ng ating mga kasama, is that the context is there. Even in our statement to this resolution that was recently adopted, we feel that there are impressions that government is now willing to engage with the UN, but we believe and we have observed that there has not been efforts to improve the conditions on the ground, and the violations have been stated already by our colleagues here. No? And then, of course, just to say that one of the things that we were actually expecting is the extension of the mandate of the High Commissioner to be able to continue monitoring the situation on the ground and report again to the Human Rights Council. So if we take a look at the first page, I will just highlight some of the preambular paragraphs, no, and connect it to the recent press statement of the government regarding the U-turn of the Human Rights Council, the seeming U-turn of the Human Rights Council. So if you take a look at the 1, 2, 3, 4, the fourth preambular paragraph, it actually states there condemning all acts of intimidation and reprisal, both online and offline, by state and non-state actors. So there is still a recognition, no, that there are reprisals and there is intimidation, not only by non-state actors, as they have said, but the state itself. No? So it's not really a total departure from what we have heard from the High Commissioner in her report. And this resolution does not actually just exist in a vacuum. It actually takes a look at the context, and that context was actually provided by the High Commissioner's report already. So this is the one that's being highlighted by NECA. Okay, and then what we can do is move forward to the recognizing the cooperation between the government of the Philippines and the UN country team. Now, this bears stressing that this is, again, as recalled by Judy and the rest, there have been what do you call this? Statements that were acrimonious to the UN in the past, and now there is an opening, and we said this in the last forum that we've had with iDEFEND. We've observed that there is really an opening, and they have started to open up with the UN. No? With the UN country team, there have been talks, but this is very recent. No? This development is very recent, but this development, we still agree, it is positive. So when we say there is cooperation between government in the Philippines and the United Nations country team, there is a recent cooperation, but it has not actually brewed into actual cooperation also. So broaden positive engagement with the UN system. We have already said that the way to broaden that positive engagement, we can actually translate into certain, let's say, indicators like government extending a standing invitation to the special procedures mechanism is an indication of broadening the engagement with the United Nations system. That's one. And then, of course, discussions of a multi-year United Nations joint program on human rights that can be discussed later on by our colleague from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So if we go down to the second page and take a look at, of course, this one is the one that I've raised earlier. No? It recognizes, of course, certain efforts by government. And for sure, these are positive efforts, but it bears repeating again that the data sharing agreement, and as I've said it in the statement, it still excludes the killings that follow the campaign against criminality. So we've also reiterated that the non-cooperation still prevails as a practice, specifically on the killings or the deaths following the campaign against criminality. And then the next one will be, maybe we can move on already to the operational paragraphs. But before that, the paragraph before that is taking note of the Philippine human rights situationer, which contains the government account of the situation of human rights. So at least there has been language that has been introduced to cite the Philippine human rights situationer, not only the government's account of it, but if you take a look at the preambular paragraph, it also cites the High Commissioner's report. No? So it takes note of the comprehensive report of the High Commissioner, so it's still there. So it's not really saying that the Human Rights Council has actually changed its mind on the situation in the Philippines. It just perhaps takes a step forward to ensure that the government of the Philippines is given a chance to address the issues that were raised in the report and the challenges that were brought forth by the report of the High Commissioner. So again, this is a positive step because it allows the Philippine government to demonstrate that they are actually squarely addressing the issues. So we will find out in the coming months. No? I'd like to also try to explain the second paragraph, which is actually looking at the importance of the government's accountability for human rights violations and abuses. No? And this is something that's really very important as well, because the bottom line is that the government should be made accountable for all the human rights cases, human rights violations, and abuses that are happening on the ground. And this is quite important, and this is something that we can perhaps translate into, let's say, an indicator that would tell us that they have accepted already and are trying to address the killings outside of the 5,000 plus almost 6,000 that the only ones that they recognize actually. So these are the things that we want. And then full and transparent investigations, we have already said that, but not only to prosecute all those who have perpetrated the serious crimes, but also to ensure that there is progress in these investigations, and we need to locate them in the justice system, whether they will be in the prosecution or whether the information is filed in courts or is being investigated by the ombudsman. And then, of course, the third is, this is something that we actually wanted to improve on also. And this is on the High Commissioner and the Office of the High Commissioner to improve the situation of the human rights, human rights in the Philippines, to provide support in the fulfillment of obligations and commitments. No? So this one actually gives us the scope of the technical assistance and capacity building. Again, it bears stressing that no amount of technical assistance and capacity building can really improve the situation on the ground if there is no change in policy. Okay? Engagement can just be a start of it, a broader engagement with the UN, but there has to be marked improvement in the engagement with domestic accountability mechanisms, including the Commission on Human Rights, and also, of course, our civil society partners. No? So it gives you the scope of the technical assistance and capacity building. And this particular paragraph was actually taken from the paragraph contained in the High Commissioner's report. No? And then we added just a few proposed amendments to it, including civic space and, of course, the Commission on Human Rights. This was a late addition to this resolution. So just to say that, among others, it's domestic investigative accountability mechanisms, data gathering on alleged police violations, civic space, although we wanted safe civic space, and then engagement with civil society and the Commission, a national mechanism for reporting and follow-up, counterterrorism legislation, which was already mentioned. The concerns were actually articulated by Attorney RP earlier on, and of course the human rights-based approaches to drug control. I will skip the others, but maybe I will go to the last one, and it really talks about what comes after this resolution, no? And this can be expounded on by Ms.Signe Poulsen, and it looks at the High Commissioner to be able to present a report at its 48th session and submit a report at its 51st session. So 1 year ang ano niyan, ang pagitan, and to be discussed in an enhanced interactive dialogue. In the last session of the Human Rights Council, that was an enhanced interactive dialogue. And that can include civil society, direct participation in the panel, of course, the Commission on Human Rights, and other UN agencies, I believe, can be part of this enhanced interactive dialogue. So that presents to you a time period within which the Philippine government can show earnest efforts, sincere efforts, credible efforts to improve the situation on the ground. As a last point, maybe perhaps just it bears repeating, of course, that we expect full cooperation from the government. We also expect and we offer full cooperation from the Commission on Human Rights as well. No? But from here on, we have a resolution that gives us the context. We have a resolution that gives us a scope, but does not limit it to that scope. And we have a resolution that we can work on so that we can translate it into indicators so that we can actually monitor the progress of not only the technical cooperation, but the progress on the ground. And that's my last point, no? That all these efforts must be directed towards improved situation on the ground and must respond to the lived experience of victims and their families. One of the lamentations that we have is that we were quite disappointed that there was no reference to victims and their families, no reference to protection of human rights defenders. And this is something that is really a hole in the resolution. So we hope that in the technical cooperation, that can become a prominent feature of the technical cooperation that will come out of this resolution. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Wow, how do you follow that? No, no, but it's a good point for point valuation of the resolution. While we're disappointed, ang daming napakitang silver linings, and then I guess it can help then us frame how we move forward. And of course, with that, moving forward. So how can the technical cooperation be operationalized, and what is the role of the UN resident coordinator and representative of the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights? So with that, this will be led by Ms.Signe Poulsen, Senior Human Rights Advisor to the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. So Ms.Signe, please, if you may.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, and thank you for allowing me to participate in this forum. It's a very valuable and interesting and timely forum to have. And when I was first invited, I was thinking, oh well, how can I, as a UN representative, how can I participate in a forum that's titled "The Collective Failure"? But then I saw that there's a question mark after that, so it gives us a little bit of space to work with, I think. And the question mark, maybe by next year, we will have, instead of a collective failure, a collective road towards progress. At least this is the hope now, and so that's where we're at. I wanted to maybe start with the report, as you've all mentioned, which was a very strong one. But we don't even have to go back to the report, actually. In her opening statement at the Human Rights Council in June, excuse me, sorry. At the council in June, the High Commissioner made it very clear that OHCHR is still equally concerned about the situation of human rights. She talked about the urgent need to revoke policies that result in killings and other violations. She talked about bringing perpetrators to justice, and she talked about the need to allow for wider civic space, but also ending the violent rhetoric that has taken place. And to quote her, and I'm reading here, I encourage the Council to remain active on this situation and to support my office's continued monitoring and reporting including to this council, as well as our technical cooperation to implement the reports, the recommendations, and continue to to pursue accountability. So 3 strands: accountability, technical cooperation, and monitoring. Now, as Commissioner Karen has just pointed out, the resolution ended up a bit differently, and really this is a reflection of the political nature of the UN and the individual member states and the negotiations that took place in that context. So that's where we're at now. Now, I was asked to talk about the joint program and what it means and where we're at and exactly how it will happen. And the short answer is, we don't have all the answers yet, but we have started looking at what such a program might look like. And let me start with saying I fully recognize what was said earlier about the risks of such a program turning into an exercise of nice outputs and outcomes that are measured by how many workshops and documents you write. And that's not what we're aiming for here. What we hope to have is a joint program. And when we say joint program, by the way, this is a joint program by many UN agencies, not a joint program with the government, because it's going to be implemented, of course, together with the government, but it's a joint program of the UN. And what we hope is that, we will have very clear indicators that are based on the situation on the ground, where we will be able to see progress. We are not naive, and we do recognize that this may take some time, and we may go through several steps on the way, and that's one of the reasons it's seen as a multi-year framework, because there are smaller things that need to change, but there are also bigger systemic things that need to be addressed. We will do it through a template that the UN usually uses, and we will include civil society in the process of developing the overall framework. We'll also talk to government, of course, and the different divisions within government that are responsible for the different areas that are outlined in the resolution. But beyond the program development, I think civil society is particularly important in a couple of ways. One of them is, of course, in advising and adjusting the path and helping us as we move along on this process in implementation. But the other thing is in oversight, because if it doesn't work, and if we're pouring our efforts and our hopes and our money into something that's not making a change, then it's really important that civil society is there to tell us and to guide us and to raise a voice so that we can start readjusting or changing or ending what's not working. As was already stated, any amount of capacity building cannot change a political will, so there can't be any substitutions there. What I also wanted to talk about a little bit is that although there is no explicit monitoring mandate in the resolution, the High Commissioner of Human Rights, of course, the OHCHR, based in Geneva, retains that global monitoring mandate that they have. The special rapporteurs will continue to monitor as they have monitored. Indeed, a good indicator could be a visit by a special rapporteur, even better, a standing invitation. There are other indicators too, but that monitoring mandate remains, and so there's nothing that stops OHCHR and the High Commissioner herself from speaking out if we see violations. I think the most recent statement she made was on the killing of the 2 human rights defenders in August, July or August, shortly after I arrived. So that will also still be there. It doesn't mean that there is a full monitoring mandate, or indeed, much less an investigating mechanism. but there are still possibilities that are there. So those remain. The 4 areas that we had in the report were campaigning against human rights violations of the campaign against illegal drugs. We had national security and civic space. We had an area of indigenous peoples, farmers, and internally displaced people, and one area on incitement to hatred and violence. And those are certainly all areas that we remain concerned about. And the project so far, we don't have a project yet, but as we are developing, we'll seek to consult on which of these need to be included as well. So that's where we're at now. And I think maybe I will end it here and allow for questions, because there seem to be many comments and questions coming in. So if that's okay, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Signe. So before we kick off the what I call the free for all discussion, or the open forum, I would like to show a video called "The Collective Failure." It's a statement by NGOs read by the World Organization Against Torture. Neka?
Thank you very much. Next speaker is World Organization Against Torture.
Colleagues in the Philippines, we are deeply disappointed that the draft item 10 resolution on the Philippines fails to reflect the gravity of the situation, including undocumented in the OHCHR report. Colleagues from the Philippines have tirelessly advocated for an international investigation at great personal risk. The thousands of victims of killings and other violations and their families continue to be deprived of justice. This is a collective failure by the states at this Council. We are shocked by the lack of support for a more robust response. We acknowledge the rationale presented for constructive engagement with the government of the Philippines. However, an approach based purely on technical cooperation and capacity building has no realistic prospect of meaningful impact, with a government that denies the true scale and severity of the human rights violations, has publicly endorsed the policy of killings, and continues to crack down on civil society. Despite the shortcomings of the resolution, it at least keeps the situation on the agenda for the next 2 years and allows for robust reporting by the OHCHR on the situation. The Council must follow developments closely and be ready to launch an independent investigation if the killings and the crackdown on civil society do not immediately end and perpetrators are not prosecuted. I thank you.
Thank you, Neka. So with that, we'll be opening the floor to a discussion. Parang palit-palitan po ng kuro-kuro, no? Siguro sa isang unang point natin, how do we really move forward with this, no? Ano ba yung magiging role natin, despite the fact that we're dismayed, there's a disappointment talaga sa mga tono natin. How do we move forward, and how do we make sure that we are included in the room, no? Despite the, as mentioned nga by Judy and RP, no, na yung narrative ay controlled ng government, and at yung environment ay, ang ating political environment ay enabled din, no, ng government. So how do we really move forward, and how do we make, again, to put a fine point on it, no, how do we make sure that we are in the room and that we can contribute or allowed to contribute? Sige po, anyone from the speakers can start po.
I'll start na siguro. For me, dalawa yung naisip ko eh. I thought of 2 things. No? One is, this is a joint statement between, or joint resolution passed with Iceland and the Philippines. And ask the government. So, put it on them, no? Ask them. So, what is going to change in terms of your commitment then and now. Where does civil society come in this technical cooperation that you're seeing? Okay, I'm seeing this because of course, we cannot force ourselves. I know that all of us in this group actually, despite our stand like this, no, in principle, we always want to be able to contribute. Okay, and many of us are actually doing that. The second point that I wanted to share here is that there actually has been positive movement, whether we admit it or not. The Iceland resolution last year, okay, or was that 2 years ago? The Iceland resolution was quite aggressive. Okay, the government actually belittled Iceland. In fact, even the president, no, was saying, "Anong country ba tong Iceland na to?" No, but what really happened behind the scenes is government, yung mga bureaucrats natin acted. They knew what this is really all about. In fact, the UN Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights was actually acknowledging that the government, okay, behind the scenes, there were bureaucrats who were really accommodating. The only thing that they did not accommodate is a visit here in the Philippines. But practically, they met. Okay, I think they met in Bangkok. High-level people from government had a dialogue. Okay, now there is this written commitment, at least from the Philippine government, saying that we will cooperate. Okay, so really, again, putting back the burden that there has been movement. Hindi pala matapang, kunyari matapang before, pero ano pala open, no? Gusto palang mag-open up. So we take the challenge now. Okay, I think if you want technical cooperation, then tignan natin gaano yung ikakasa nyo sa technical cooperation. And then, in short, at the end of it, magkakaalaman ulit tayo. No? In terms of, that's why I was asking, how do we measure sincerity? Because that technical cooperation opportunity has always been on the table, no? Has always been there. Kaya tayo umabot dun sa report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is simply because the government, okay, this particular government is refusing to cooperate from the first instance, at least from that political standpoint again. Okay, so we are not belittling the efforts that are also being done behind the background, okay, or behind the scenes in the background. So yun po ang tingin ko dito.
Thank you. Thank you, RP. Yes, Judy. Go ahead.
Hingi ako ng kape ni RP kasi parang positive, no? Gusto ko yun. Kaso mapait yung kape ko. I think for me, it's really they were feeling the heat. They know that the international community's eyes are on the human rights situation in the Philippines. Andyan pa yung EU dangling yung pag-alis sa atin dun sa GSP Plus, no? Yung sa trade privileges natin. So talagang meron na may impact yung pag-iingay ng international solidarity groups at syempre ng natin sa pag-put ng spotlight dun sa human rights situation in the Philippines. So they have to act. And so ako tingin ko talaga they have to be accommodating. But they're still sticking to the almost 6,000 killings. They have no acknowledgement of the other killings. They keep tagging us as terrorists. Walang change doon sa attitude nila over us and on human rights. What has changed is their so-called openness. So I think, yun nga, this is a play and we have to expose that. We have to expose that on the ground, these are empty engagements. That on the ground, these are what's actually happening. So I think that's the major, urgent, and not so and dangerous task that we should continue yung ganong pagpapalabas ng katotohanan. Pero ang second point ko rin, there are groups, and I'm happy that ka-aliado natin ang CHR, and we have Attorney RP and other groups who are willing to engage. And I'm happy we're having discussion with Ms.Signe, because then, as I've said, if there's really a real opening on the technical cooperation, then we have to be very clear. What are the metrics? What are the indicators that are in place to say that this resolution or the technical cooperations and capacity building activities are really geared towards, and I repeat, seeking accountability for the perpetrators of the violation, seeking state accountability, seeking justice for the victims, and putting up institutional protective mechanisms for us human rights defenders. But unless, sabi nga ni Ma'am Karen, unless these are not put in the conversation of technical cooperations, then this will just be a continuously a show of the Duterte government.
Thank you, Judy. Anybody else who would like to comment or react on the points given by RP and Judy? Yeah, if you're all good, just a few questions from our friends from the media. Ms. Jodes Gavilan from Rapplers would like to ask Commissioner Karen Gomez Dumpit two questions really. First, the CHR isn't part of the review panel regarding the drug war killings, if this is true. So if this is true, how do you plan on dealing with that on moving when you want to move forward with the resolution? Did they give you any reason why you are excluded in the review panel? And how is your experience so far with the data sharing regarding AO35?
Thank you for that question, Jodes. No? First and foremost, when Secretary Guevara spoke last July in the July session of the Human Rights Council after hearing the report of the High Commissioner, he did say that the Commission on Human Rights would play a role in the review panel, independent review panel led by the DOJ. Now, a few days after that, we have written to him, and we have written thrice. They have not responded yet on what role we will play. But they did promise that by November, they will be making a report. The interagency mechanism will be rendering a report in November. That's what we heard last July. So we wrote already 3 times, wala pang sagot. How do you plan on dealing with that moving forward? We will keep on writing. We will keep on monitoring. We will keep on advising government and recommending actions so that we can see improvement on the ground. We can see a response to cases. We can see accountability, or we can observe if there is none. No reason yet has been given. No? I had a meeting with Yusek Perete last, I think it was last week, but he resigned already. So I think we're back to square one. But he did say that they received the letter, but they're not yet ready to respond. Now, just to let you know that today, the DOJ actually called for a face-to-face meeting. And they are talking about under Administrative Order 35. They're talking about a discussions. Probably this is like a what do you call that? An initial discussion amongst stakeholders and among agencies, part of the Administrative Order number 35, that interagency mechanism on political killings, enforced disappearance, and torture. They talked about the cooperation program, no? Joint cooperation program. So maybe this is the beginning of it. The Chair Chito actually attended this meeting today, and tomorrow I think they will still continue with the workshop. So we'll see. But we did have many questions that we posed in that workshop this morning, and no less than the chair was the one who posed those questions because we wanted to be clarified. Is AO35 now going to be expanded to cover all killings? Because the standard answer from them in the recent past is that other mechanisms will deal with the killings involving the campaign against illegal drugs. No? That's their standard answer there. So based on my last meeting last week with Yusek Perete, we were discussing other possible projects. He said that hindi pa yun yung ano doon. Other mechanisms will cover that. No? And then it bears stressing that in AO35, while we are included in that mechanism, we are an observer. And we were invited as an observer today to that workshop. We are also invited as a resource person, resource institution there. So how is your experience so far on the data sharing? Wala pang na-share na data. Just as we said, even including in my statement responding to the recently adopted resolution on technical cooperation, I did say that the data sharing agreement again excludes the killings arising from the campaign against illegal drugs. It excludes that. There has been no data shared yet, according to our executive director who just texted me that answer. So again, it's a recent development, and it's a positive development, even if it's a recent one. But at the end of the day, we will still ensure that we will monitor the progress of that data sharing agreement, and it has to be two-way, because we need a lot of information also. Even in the AO35 cases, we need to know what those cases are. We need to know, we need to have information also, the information that they have, they also need to share with us. It's a two-way process. But again, wala pa. That's why we said it's just recently signed. So we expect a lot more from that data sharing agreement in the coming days. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Karen. And another couple of questions directed at Ms.Signe. Do you have any idea what government agencies will be involved in the technical cooperation, and what is the role of AHRC member states and embassies in the Philippines in the cooperation, the technical cooperation, if there are any?
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of the agencies that will be involved, of course, there will be different agencies involved depending on a particular topic. But our main interlocutors right now is, of course, the Department of Foreign Affairs, which is involved in the Geneva process at the Human Rights Council, and also the Department of Justice, who, of course, is engaged with many of the mechanisms where we want to see some changes in relation to accountability, in relation to state, different measures that are included in the resolution. So those, but also law enforcement and others who will be involved in those mechanisms that in many cases are multi-department mechanisms. In terms of the role of member states, I mean, in every country, embassies and member states have a human rights mandate and a human rights role to play. And in the Philippines, of course, a number of embassies are already involved in programs that are related to some of the work we are doing or we plan to do. So you have things like the EU Go Just program, which is addressing some of the things that we also will link to. So there's a connection in that way. And we do count on the international community and the member states to give us the political support and also the cooperate in technical ways where that is relevant and important.
Thank you, Signe. Just one. This is a question again that is most probably directed at. Oh, I think she got cut off. Is Signe? Are you still here?
She got cut off.
I think she got cut off. Ooh, no. So let's just keep on discussing because the next question was supposed to be directed at her. Ano po ba? Oh, she's back. Oh, is she? No. Ano ba yung mga steps na iti-take ng resident coordinator if there are no substantial improvement of the human rights situation in the country, particularly if the killings continue, if the attacks on the HRDs is pursued. But because she's not here, maybe I'll just post one question that I got from someone who texted me.
She's back na, sorry, she's back.
She's back.
Yeah,
Signe,
sorry.
are you back?
Yes.
Oh, there you are. Yeah. The question is a question directed at you is what are the steps that you are going to take, you and your office are going to take if there are no substantial improvement on the human rights situation in the Philippines, particularly if the killings do continue, the attacks on HRDs are not abated?
Well, as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we have an ongoing global monitoring mandate, and so that will continue, and reporting on that will also continue. Then there is a political process which is related to member states and where they want to take it in the Human Rights Council. So there are various mechanisms that will continue to kick in as they have done, as they do with other countries as well. But it's it's difficult, and I do hope we engage in this process with a genuine intention that we will see an improvement.
Yeah. Thank you, Signe. From Ron Jonathan, a question that he is posing to everyone. What are the major challenges, do you think? Sorry, let me rephrase that. What do you think would be the major challenges to the implementation of the technical cooperation resolution? Anybody?
Wilnor?
Yes? Go ahead, Jude.
Yeah, hearing earlier that the interagency mechanism will also be consisting of law enforcers when they themselves are supposedly, they need to be held accountable. That really, it's really a challenge to build trust on the mechanism itself. So that's the reason why we have been calling for an international mechanism to exact accountability. So that's one, no? And then, of course, it's a challenge when there's already an anti-terrorism law. While there are petitions against it, and there are oral arguments that are pending, that would also delimit advocates from continuing to exact accountability, because it would tend to silence critics as well. So as I've said in the beginning, the action from the UN mechanisms are long due. We wonder what else are they waiting for, because what we are looking forward is not just improvement in the situation. What we are looking forward to is really accountability, and that has been repeated several times, no? Maaaring magbago, maaaring mabawasan ang paglabag sa karapatang pantao. There could be less human rights violations, but our problem is what happened to justice? What happened to what the victims have been calling for and their families, which is not only indemnification, but really bringing perpetrators to justice. As long as there's a culture of impunity with the United Nations accomplice to it, that doesn't really give a lot of confidence on the part of the people. Maaaring kami may tapang dahil nandito kami sa mga organization, and we have this united, at least we have solidarity. But I wonder about the people in general. No? It's very alarming, given also the survey that says that this government still enjoys popularity. That also complicates the situation for our people, because it confuses. It clearly confuses them as to what the situation really is. We are on the ground and we see it, but clearly the atmosphere of fear and impunity also contributes to what the people are going to say when there are surveys, when they are asked about this administration, etc. That surely affects people who are being asked about their feedback about this government. But we have evidences, we have documentation. What more does the UN want? For it to exact accountability and help us who are being attacked left and right. So that's a huge challenge, no? Kabilaan yung atake sa atin na patuloy na nagdodokumento, lumalaban at iba pa. At ang napakalaki ng kalaban natin pagdating doon sa atmosphere nga ng impunity at saka ng takot. Alam ko na marami ang natatakot, kung kaya mas madaling sabihin sa mga survey na gusto pa rin nila ang gobyernong ito.
Salamat, Jean. At napakalaking issue nga talaga yung trust. Palagi nating nire-raise yan. How can you trust the same people who we believe have committed the abuses, na sila din ang i-investigate, no? Parang isang malaking malaking question mark, no? Anybody else who would like to answer the question posted by Ron on the mga challenges na harapin po ng pag-implement ng resolution na to?
Wilnor, para sa akin, dugtungan ko yung sinabi ni Jean, yung political will. Okay? Jean already mentioned exacting accountability. And when we look at the joint resolution, it talks about condemnation, for example, no? Condemning all acts of intimidation and reprisal as one example. One way of showing political will and ensuring that there is good faith in implementing this joint resolution is to stop red tagging. Okay? Another is to admit what are the lapses and mistakes. Kasi you're talking about cooperation, technical cooperation. And this is not, this resolution is actually a response to an earlier, stronger, or to an earlier strong, hindi stronger, to an earlier strong resolution. No? So what are the lapses? What are the mistakes in order that to implement this technical cooperation at the moment? And lastly, for me, just to show political will, what are the commitments? Because this resolution is couched in diplomatic language. So when you talk about technical cooperation, ano yung commitment ng government? What are the results promised? And I think if we now put this diplomatic document into more concrete terms, then that is where we can test the political will of the government, the Philippine government on this. Salamat.
Salamat, RP. Anybody pa po? Yes, Karen. Please go ahead.
Just to so we're adding to the story, parang train. So if it's trust and then political will, one of the things that maybe we can also take into consideration is the current crisis we're now in, because of the pandemic. That's a clear challenge, because freedom of expression is naturally curtailed, kumbaga, because we cannot really, we're not free to move about So yung expressions na ganyan. And then aside from that is that nothing really beats actual cooperation by government, actual engagement by government. But then again, we need there has to be a clear demonstration that civil society can actually engage with them in a safe space. Yun ang ano dun eh, yun ang siguro pinaka-challenge din doon. When you see the recent controversy arising from Facebook taking down fake accounts on the basis of coordinated inauthentic behavior, and then the next day the admission of security sector saying that they were also managing some of these accounts is quite disturbing, because these accounts contain fake news, and it's being propagated. So this is something that we need to grapple with. Do we allow this to happen? Is it acceptable that even official Facebook pages of security sector in the regions, you will find posters of kunyari ang representation is COVID, tapos mga nakalagay doon yung mga human rights defenders, yung mga human rights organizations saying that they're like the virus. So it's really red tagging, but this is coming from a regional office of let's say the Philippine National Police or a unit in Mindanao, for instance. So these things don't help actually. So we need to ensure that there is a safe environment for human rights defenders to operate, for victims to be able to safely access services, for services to be there in the first place and should be available, diba? So, but I think the first indication that the challenge is being overcome maybe is to be able to come up with a program already that will be jointly designed by, developed by not only the government, but also civil society and the Commission on Human Rights. Maybe that's the first step. But if they don't include us in the development of this program, which I believe that the resident coordinator here in the UN country team in the Philippines has actually committed to include the Commission as a full partner in the development of the cooperation program and also in the program itself. So that's something that we have to see, and that's something that we have to see sooner rather than later.
Salamat, Karen. Kung meron pa po bang gusto nyo dagdag yung ating mga speakers? Medyo I'm looking at the time at medyo press for time po tayo, no. Alam ko na exciting ang ating pinag-uusapan kahit na medyo depressing. ang situation and again, no, pero may mga silver linings on how to move forward. Before we continue, meron po tayong video, if it's okay, Neka, video statement from Nimia of the Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Advocates and the Executive Director of the Philippine Human Rights Information Center, before we continue po.
Matagal nang kinakampanya ng aming grupo ang pagsasakatuparan ng isang independent at international na investigasyon sa kalagayan ng karapatang pantao sa Pilipinas. Ito ay idinulog namin sa UN Human Rights Council mula pa noong 2016 sa simula ng rehimeng Duterte. Sa araw na ito, ikinalulungkot naming ipahayag na ang naging resolusyon ng ika-45 pulong ng UN Human Rights Council ay ang pagkakaroon ng teknikal na pakikipagtulungan sa mga ahensya ng gobyerno bilang pagtugon sa malawakang pagpatay at karahasang dulot ng giyera laban sa droga. Matatandaang iniutos ng Human Rights Council sa High Commissioner for Human Rights na si Madam Michelle Bachelet na magsagawa ng pagsisiyasat sa kalagayan ng karapatang pantao sa bansa dahil sa mga ulat ng libu-libong pagpatay at mga matitinding paglabag sa karapatang pantao ng gobyerno. Sinundan ito ng ulat ng High Commissioner na nagsasabing may malawakang paglabag sa karapatang pantao at paulit-ulit na kawalan ng pananagutan ng mga may sala. May mahalagang rekomendasyon ang High Commissioner sa kanyang report, kabilang na ang pagbabasura ng Oplan double barrel, pagtigil sa mga extrajudicial killing at marahas na pakikitungo sa mga drug suspects, ang pagbabasura ng Executive Order 32 at pagsisiyasat sa implementasyon ng Executive Order 70, pagpapalakas sa mga mekanismo ng accountability o pananagutan, kasama na ang pagkakaroon ng National Preventive Mechanism sa torture at pagluwag sa civic spaces, proteksyon sa mga katutubo at pagpapaigting ng kooperasyon sa UN human rights mechanisms. Ang kasalukuyang resolusyon tungkol sa technical cooperation ay maliit na bahagi lamang ng lahat ng rekomendasyong ito at may mabigat na rekisito bago maisakatuparan. Ipinagpapalagay ng kasalukuyang resolusyon na gumagana ang sistema ng hustisya at mga mekanismo sa bansa na tumutugon sa paglabag sa karapatang pantao. May palagay na may nakatayong proseso na tutugon sa pangangailangan ng mga biktima at may ligtas at produktibong relasyon ang mga human rights defenders sa gobyerno. Mapanganib ang pananalig sa ganitong mga kabulaanan, sapagkat kung hindi matutugunan ang mas malawak na usapin ng kasalukuyang polisiya ng pagpatay at karahasan, magsisilbi lamang panlansi ang technical cooperation sa totoong tugon para sa hustisya. Kung kaya't nananawagan kami sa lahat ng mamamayang Pilipino, habang sinusubok nating ugnayan ang proseso ng kooperasyon sa pagitan ng UNHRC at ng gobyerno, ipagpatuloy ang ating laban ng walang pasubali at walang pag-aalinlangan. Tuloy-tuloy ang ating pagmumulat, pag-oorganisa at pagkilos. Hindi tayo kailanman mabibigo kung ang ating laban ay para sa karapatang pantao.
Thank you, Neka. That's Nimia Simbulan, Dr. Nimia Simbulan, the Executive Director of the Philippine Human Rights Information Center, and she's also from the Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Advocates. We are a little bit pressed for time, so mabigat sa aking kalooban, pero I would like to ask Sana for the any closing statements or closing remarks from our pool of speakers today. Maybe we should start with the let's start with RP, letter A.
Thank you, Wilnor. And maybe Judy might be asking ano ulit yung kape ko, no? Pero iba talaga tayong I mean I'm acknowledging, no, there are a lot of different experiences by people, especially by people on the ground. Totoong maraming naghihirap, okay? But with regard to this resolution, I'm also personally just realistic, no, na this is an output by a diplomatic and this is a diplomatic output, okay? And that's why I'm still saying, and I agree that there is a silver lining as well here, and acknowledging that this has also been a step forward. We may not like the current wording of the resolution. We wanted much more, okay? But true justice must come from within the Philippines. And I think this is where many of us have been working to change and to strengthen our institutions. So again, for me, the silver lining that I hope to achieve here is to make the government again accountable for their statement in this resolution, to ask them, where is your political will? how are we going to move forward with this? Let us be realistic, okay? And with that, okay, if and when it happens that the political will actually fails, okay, then the reality will be unmasked as well, okay? I do hope when that happens, okay, then the international community would make a much stronger statement, stronger than the Iceland resolution that has been the basis of this current resolution. Okay, but for now, then we will work with the cards that are dealt with us. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, RP. Ms. Jean Enriquez from the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women Asia Pacific.
Thank you again, Wilnor. And of course, anytime you can also give your statement. Thank you for this opportunity. Perhaps what I would just want to add is that I know that the United Nations is not monolithic. I understand that there are mechanisms that continue, that will continue to monitor and be able to do everything so that our call for justice will also be facilitated. Our call for accountability will also be facilitated. There are special rapporteurs. We know that there are numerous human rights defenders within the mechanism itself. So we will continue to push, of course, the United Nations to take on a more honest, a more courageous stance on the human rights situation in the Philippines. And while they do that, as RP said, of course, within the Philippines, we will also continue to document. We will continue to compile evidences. We will continue to exhaust if there are local mechanisms for redress, just so we will move towards what the women survivors really want, which is accountability from the highest officials of the land. So kahit nasa kulungan pa kami, umabot, patuloy kaming lalaban para sa accountability at katarungan. Maraming salamat.
Salamat, Jean. At sana naman ay hindi talaga sa kulungan. Huwag kang mag-alala. Magsasama-sama tayo kahit saan pa yan. Now we would like to call Miss Judy. My mistake kanina, siya po ang national coordinator, overall coordinator po ng LILAK, hindi ba executive director. Judy?
Oo. Actually, iniisip ko pa rin yung tanong ng what's the biggest challenge in the implementation of the results. And tas of the resolution, tas may finorward si Ma'am Karen Dumpit na statement daw from Malacanang that Malacanang is pleased with the news. So I think for me, the greatest challenge in the implementation of this resolution is Duterte himself, because now he feels emboldened. Ay, di ba? His ploy worked to appear open, to submit a report, to appear to the General Assembly, and now he feels nagkaroon ng kapalit yung ganung drama niya. And now he feels more emboldened, and that is scarier. If he feels that now he has withdrawn the heat from the international community, he might feel, and I think that's my fear, that he feels that he will continue with his brazen violation of human rights and say that I can get away with it. And that's the scariest part. And so I think the silver lining then, if I would use Attorney RP, is that whatever there is, nandun sa agenda pa rin ang Philippines. Whether that's just technical cooperation, it's still in the agenda, and we should be able to find ways to push for more meaningful implementation of such a resolution, and we should keep on working towards making the Philippines in the human rights agenda of the UN. And how do we do that? We continue intensely our international solidarity work, not with the state, but with the people to people, tao sa tao na na solidarity at pakikiisa. And then, our movements globally might be able to push for a more meaningful resolution and push the greatest challenge of the human rights, to push down this greatest challenge of human rights in the country. At bilang panguli, ang malaking gawain natin ngayon with Duterte being emboldened with the anti-terror law, nandyan, we should keep on strengthening each other's yung pagpapalakas ng loob ng bawat isa. Dahil tayo ay natatakot, magpalakas pa tayo ng ating loob sa bawat isa at patuloy tayong magtulak ng ating karapatan dahil naniniwala tayo sa ating pinaglalaban. Magandang gabi po sa ating lahat.
Thank you, Judy. And now, letter K, no? So A, J, and then K. Ms. Karen Dumpit, Ms. Dumpit from the Commission on Human Rights.
Thank you, Wilnor. It bears repeating what I gave as a statement, no, in the adoption of the resolution. And I say this again: expectation is more disquieting than opposition. Mas worrisome yun. And we will expect that the Philippine government's impression to cooperate translates into state accountability. It should create a safe civic space and must result in timely, effective remedies for families and for victims and their families. No? The Commission on Human Rights will continue to monitor the situation on the ground and continue to advise government on the actions that must be taken, and we will hold their word to it. As as the spokesperson said earlier, that the Philippines vows full cooperation with respect to the resolution. So each and every word in that resolution will certainly be translated into indicators so that we can objectively say whether the Philippine government is really living up to its commitment when they spearheaded this resolution together with Iceland during this Human Rights Council session. So maraming salamat.
Thank you, Karen. And Ms.Signe from the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights.
Yes, thank you. It's hard to follow all of you, but I do think, you know, we talked about challenges, but I think we should also talk about strengths. And one of the things that the Philippines has, which I haven't seen everywhere else, is an incredibly strong and well educated and diverse and broad human rights civil society movement, and also a Human Rights Commission, of course, since they're here, that actually is able to make very concrete changes. Maybe it doesn't feel like it in the resolution, but every day in people's lives outside of the capital and everywhere else too. And I think looking forward, especially if we take a bit of a longer view, this is a real uniqueness and a real strength that you have and that will make a difference and that is making a difference, but probably even more in the longer term will have a very big impact. It's said that the arch of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And I really think if we look at the situation here, we need to keep this in mind. And it's also why the resolution indeed calls for a multi-year program on capacity building. We realize that it will take time. We realize there will be challenges as we move ahead. But I think, again, going back to the big strength we have is that we have a lot of people who will be there and help us and who are committed to this human rights issue. So I'll end with that because I do think it's something we should keep in mind at all times. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms.Signe. I am tasked to make a synthesis of the full discussion, pero napakahirap po nun, lalo na kung sabi ko nga ganito mga heavyweights yung ating mga panauhin ng ating mga speakers. So siguro para lang rejoinder sa sinabi ng lahat, ang hinihingi po ng lahat ay accountability, no? Yun lang po, it's very clear from the first speaker to the last. That's our demand. That's what we want. That's what we're expecting from the resolution. And that's what we're expecting from the UNHRC. That's what we're expecting from the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights na imo-monitor. And at the end of the day, that is what we will be expecting from the government of the Philippines. We have discussed trust. We have discussed political will. We have discussed sincerity. But at the end of the day, sabi nga po ni RP at sabi rin ng lahat, makikita natin sa ground kung may changes ba na mangyayari. At doon din po yung mangyayaring reckoning natin. We operate on hope. Each and every organization, each and every individual that I have worked with in the past years, we operate on hope. Pragmatic, sensible, logical, realistic na hope. So we expect that the government will keep true to its promise kahit na alam nyo para ulit-ulit tayong niloloko, pero we will expect you to do something. The challenge is not just from us, but the challenge is on the government. And we will not go away. You can wish us away every time you speak, sa iyong podium at pinamura-mura mo kami, but we will not go. And with that, we would like to thank everyone for tuning in. Again, this is Wilnor Papa together with the speakers, our brilliant speakers, Enriquez from the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women Asia Pacific, Karen Dumpit from the Commissioner on Human Rights, si Judy Pasimio from LILAK, RP Santiago from the Ateneo Human Rights Center, Ms.Signe Poulsen from the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, and in behalf of iDEFEND, again, this is Wilnor Papa, your moderator for the night. Marami pa po kami mga programa in the next few days. And then, Rose, any announcements po from your end?
Again, thank you very much, Wilnor, and to all our guests. This will not be the last time we will be hearing about this technical cooperation, because we really need to monitor how it is implemented and how it is operationalized. I really do not know if it is fair now to put the hope on the UN resident coordinator, because he will be the main person who will ensure that this cooperation will be successfully done. Because still, we cannot trust the government to really fully comply with this resolution unless substantial actions are seen. While we will continue to monitor human rights compliance by the government, we will engage and we will contribute to the technical cooperation resolution. This is for the victims, for indigenous people, for the farmers, for the IDPs, for the human rights defenders, and for the public, to protect and promote our human rights. So we will not stop. We will continue to struggle. Lalabas po tayo at lalaban po tayo. Salamat ng marami.
$191 people have lost their lives.
COVID-19 is spreading.
Department of Health reported 9 new confirmed cases. Patients 25.
Measures na pinapatupad ngayon gaya ng social distancing.
Wala pa silang natatanggap na ayuda mula sa pamahalaan bilang pagsunod sa isinasaad sa enhanced community.
Ng mga inaasikasong COVID-19 patients, maraming doktor ang hindi na po nakakauwi.
Take urgent and aggressive action.
Lumabas tayo.
Lumabas tayo sa makitid na pananaw, papunta sa malawak na pag-unawa sa isa't isa, lalo para sa mga taong naisasantabi at kailangan pakinggan.
Lumabas tayo mula sa mga kanya-kanyang pag-aalala, lampas sa sari-sariling pangamba, dahil ang kailangang harapin ay sinusubok tayong magkakasama.
Lumabas tayo mula sa pananahimik. Dahil ngayong ang buhay natin ang nakataya, ay hindi dapat pipi at nakapikit. Napapastulin nila tungong bangin.
Lumabas tayo mula sa dilim ng panlilinlang at panlilito. Malinaw sa atin kung ano ang gusto nating masalubong sa paglabas natin ngayon papuntang bukas.
Kabuhayan na sasapat,
Kain na busog,
tahanan nakakanlong, malayang umalam, kumilos, makialam.
Unahin ang kapakanan ng mamamayan, kilalanin ang karapatan.
Lalabas tayo sa kabanatang ito sa buhay natin. Baon ng katotohanan may mas malalaki pa tayong mapagwawagian.
Na hindi na tayo papayag maipasok muli sa ganitong hirap na kalagayan dahil matutut tayong lumaban sa iba pang mga sakit ng lipunan.
Lumabas tayo. Lumaban tayo.